I still remember the way the auditorium smelled that night, like polished wood and faint dust, as if 1,000 other stories had already lived on that stage and were now clinging to the walls, waiting for one more to unfold. My hands trembled a little as I adjusted my tie, not because I was nervous for myself, but because my son was about to step into a spotlight that I had never known. I'd never been to a TED talk before. Truth be told, I didn't even fully understand what it was until he explained it over the phone months earlier. "It's like a big platform for ideas, Dad," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "I got invited to give one, can you believe it?" And of course I could believe it. I had always believed in him even when he doubted himself. That's what fathers are supposed to do, right? To carry belief when their children are too young or too tired to hold it themselves. So there I was, one seat from the aisle, my wife beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The stage curtains glowed crimson under the house lights, and people all around us whispered in anticipation. Some of them were his colleagues, some strangers, all waiting to hear what he had to say about gratitude. Gratitude. The irony didn't hit me yet. At that moment, I was simply a father, proud, leaning forward in his seat as if the sheer force of my posture could lift his son higher into the rafters. The MC came out, read his name, and the applause was thunderous. My chest swelled so much I thought the buttons of my shirt might burst. I caught my wife's eye and saw tears there, proud tears, the kind that blur the years of hard work and late nights into a single shimmering moment. He walked onto the stage with the ease of someone who had rehearsed for weeks. The spotlight found him, and for a moment it felt as though the world had found him too. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady, warm, confident. I clasped my hands together, pressing my knuckles against my lips. I wanted to freeze the moment, to bottle it, to take it back with me to those years when he was just a boy running around the backyard, dirt on his knees, shouting, "Watch me, Dad, watch me." Now the whole world was watching him, and I was watching from the shadows, my heart pounding with pride. He spoke about gratitude as though it were oxygen, invisible yet vital. He told stories about mentors, teachers, and unexpected friends who had guided him. Each anecdote painted a picture of someone who had lifted him higher, steadied him when he stumbled. The audience leaned in with every word. Heads nodded, smiles spread. A soft hum of agreement filled the room. I leaned in too, waiting for the part where he would say "my father," waiting for the story where he might recall how I drove him to baseball practice after long shifts at the factory, or how I stayed up late on the nights he panicked over math homework, or how I worked weekends so he could take that trip to Washington, D.C. for his debate team. Waiting for him to say that behind every step he took, there had been someone who quietly cleared the path. But in that first moment, none of that mattered. In those opening words, he was my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy who once asked me if the stars ever got tired of shining. I want to pause here if you don't mind. If you're listening to this story right now, maybe you've known a similar moment. Maybe you've sat in the dark of an auditorium, your hands shaking as your child or someone you love stepped into the light. If you have, then you know exactly what I mean when I say there is no pride like that pride. And if you're new here, if you've stumbled onto my story by chance, let me say, welcome. I share these stories not because I am special, but because I believe we all carry untold stories inside us. Stories about love, about family, about heartbreak and healing. If you've ever felt invisible, or if you've ever given everything without expecting applause, you'll find a home here. So if you're with me, stay a little longer. Like this story if it resonates. Subscribe if you want more, not for me, but for the reminder that your story matters too, because it does. Now let's go back to that night. When my son paused for effect, the silence was thick and beautiful. Then he smiled and the crowd leaned even closer. He spoke of gratitude as though it was a fire that had been passed to him, one torch at a time. He named his college professor, a man who had encouraged him to pursue ideas. He named his best friend, who had believed in his work when no one else did. He even named a neighbor who once offered him a kind word during a rough patch. The audience applauded at each name. They admired his humility, his generosity in giving credit. I admired it too. I really did, but I kept waiting, waiting for my name to appear in the constellation he was drawing, and it didn't. Not in the first 10 minutes, not in the next 20. The talk was only 20 minutes long. By the end, I realized I had been holding my breath the entire time. When the applause came, it was like a wave crashing against the shore. People stood. They clapped, they cheered. My wife rose with them, tears streaming down her cheeks. I rose too, but my hands felt heavy, almost reluctant. It's a strange thing to be proud and wounded at the same time, to feel your heart swell with love while also sinking under the weight of absence. I told myself it didn't matter, that this was his moment, not mine, that gratitude doesn't need to be public to be real. And yet, as I stood there clapping, I felt something hollow open inside me, like an echo in an empty room. Driving home later, the city lights flickering across the windshield, I kept replaying his words in my head. I owe everything to those who saw me, who believed in me. I wanted to believe that I was one of those people he meant, even if he hadn't said it. But the truth lingered, heavy and unshakable. In that room full of people, under the glare of the spotlight, I was invisible. And for the first time in my life as a father, I wasn't sure how to feel about that. The morning after his talk, I woke up earlier than usual. That happens sometimes when your mind won't let your body rest. I padded into the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at the table with the same old mug I've had for years, the one with a fading picture of my son on it, wearing his little league uniform, his cap slightly crooked, smiling with teeth too big for his face. I turned the mug in my hand, the way you might hold a photograph you've seen 1,000 times but still can't look away from. He was 9 years old in that picture. 9 years old, and I was his hero. He'd yell my name from across the field, wave at me every time he got on base. Last night, though, in that auditorium filled with strangers and applause, I might as well have been a ghost. I tried not to think about it too hard at first. I told myself it was just 20 minutes. He couldn't fit everyone in. I told myself it doesn't mean he doesn't love you. And yet the silence of my name echoed louder than any of his words. You see, when you've spent decades building something, a family, a life, you don't realize how much you expect to at least be noticed. Not celebrated, not paraded, just noticed. Instead, I sat there, clapping, smiling on the outside while something inside me crumbled quietly. My wife noticed, of course. She always does. "You were quiet on the drive home," she said that morning, sliding into the chair across from me. She poured herself coffee but didn't drink it right away. She just studied me. "I'm fine," I lied. She tilted her head. "You're not fine. Talk to me." But what was I supposed to say? That I felt betrayed, that I felt erased? It sounded childish even to me. Fathers aren't supposed to need thank yous. We're supposed to stand in the background, steady as telephone poles while the world spins around our children. Still, it stung. "I just thought," I began, then stopped. The words felt heavy, like they'd sink if I tried to lift them out. "I thought maybe he'd mention me." Her eyes softened. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "I know," she whispered, and that was it. She didn't say more, didn't need to, because in marriage sometimes silence is the only language you need. Later that day, I found myself in the garage, rummaging through old boxes I hadn't touched in years. I don't even know what I was looking for. Maybe proof that I'd been there, that I'd mattered. I found a shoebox filled with ticket stubs from school plays, football games, band recitals. Each one was a reminder that I'd been sitting in those seats long before that auditorium filled with TED Talk strangers. I found an old drawing he'd made in 3rd grade, me with a cape. "Super Dad" scribbled in the corner. His handwriting was crooked, but the love was clear. I sat on the cold garage floor and stared at that drawing until my vision blurred. How do you go from being Super Dad to being invisible? I thought back to the talk, the way he listed names like rosary beads, one after another, each person a saint in his story. My college professor taught me how to think. My best friend believed in me when no one else did. My mentor showed me the power of persistence. And each time the audience clapped, my heart sank a little lower, because all I could think was, who drove you to college, who stayed up when you cried in frustration, who worked double shifts so you could afford books and trips and everything else you needed. But maybe that's not what TED talks are for. Maybe fathers don't make good anecdotes for the stage. We're too ordinary, too expected, too invisible. That night, I sat in my recliner while the house was quiet, and I let myself feel it all, the pride, the hurt, the confusion. They swirled together like oil and water, refusing to blend, refusing to make sense. I wanted to be proud. I was proud, but I also wanted to be seen. It's strange, isn't it? Gratitude is supposed to be this simple thing: say thank you, mean it, move on. But the absence of gratitude, it lingers, it festers. It makes you question whether the sacrifices you made were really sacrifices at all, or just noise no one ever heard. A few days later, friends and neighbors started talking about the talk. "Your boy was incredible," one of them said at the grocery store. "You must be so proud." I smiled, nodded, said the right words because I was proud, but I also wanted to scream, "Yes, I'm proud. But did you notice he didn't mention me? Did you notice I don't exist in his story?" Of course, I never said that. I just went home, put the groceries away, and sat at the table with that fading mug again. Sometimes being invisible isn't about not being seen. It's about being seen through. That's how I felt, like glass, transparent, present but only as background. And yet the world clapped for him. The world nodded at his stories of gratitude. The world cheered for his humility. And I sat in the shadows, the invisible man, wondering if gratitude was just another performance, something we practice for the stage but forget to live at home. The days passed, but the feeling didn't. It grew heavier, thicker. I didn't want to resent him. I love my son. I'd give him the shirt off my back even now, but love doesn't cancel out hurt. It just makes it more complicated. At night, I lay awake replaying the talk, every line etched into my memory. I tried to imagine what it would have felt like to hear my name just once, to know that in front of that sea of strangers he remembered me. Instead, all I heard was silence, and sometimes silence can be the loudest sound in the world. The strange thing about memory is how it chooses its own timing. You don't summon it. It just comes, uninvited, like a guest who still knows where you keep the spare key. After the talk, after the long drive home, after the quiet morning staring into that fading mug, my memories started arriving at odd hours. They would come while I was fixing the fence, or when I bent down to tie my shoes, or even in the middle of folding laundry. I'd suddenly hear the sound of a boy's laughter echoing in the backyard, and for a moment I'd almost expect to see him come running around the corner, knees dirty, hair sticking out in all directions, shouting, "Dad, watch this." Those echoes were everywhere. One of the earliest came from a summer night when he was maybe 6 years old. He had just learned how to ride his bike without training wheels. He begged me to let him ride down the sloping street by our house. "It's too steep," I said. "I can do it," he insisted, chest puffed out, the way only a child believes in their invincibility. So I jogged beside him, hand hovering just above the seat, ready to catch him if he fell. I remember the sweat dripping down my back, the sound of his squeaky brakes, the way his little voice shouted, "Don't let go, Dad." But of course I had to let go. That's the rule of bikes and maybe of life itself. One day you loosen your grip, and the child who once clung to you learns how to balance on his own. He didn't fall that night, he soared. And when he reached the bottom of the hill, he looked back at me, arms raised, triumphant. "I did it, did you see me?" I waved, panting, laughing. "Of course I saw you, I was right here." Another memory, a stormy winter evening. He was in middle school working on a science project, a model volcano that was due the next day. The glue wouldn't hold, the paper mache kept collapsing, and he burst into tears, frustrated. I stayed up with him until midnight mixing flour paste, holding the pieces steady while he shaped them. "You're gonna remember this volcano," I joked, "because it nearly killed your old man." He laughed through his tears, the way kids do when they want to believe everything will be okay. And by morning, the volcano stood tall. He got in on that project. He never mentioned that his father's fingerprints were all over the mountain. hidden beneath the paint. But I knew. And then high school. Those years were a blur of car rides. Early mornings to drop him at practice, late nights picking him up after rehearsals. Sometimes he slept in the passenger seat, his head pressed against the window, the streetlights streaking across his face. I'd glance over at him and think one day he'll be driving himself. One day he won't need me for this. But until that day I drove. Mile after mile, hour after hour, even when my back ached from long shifts, because that's what fathers do. We get behind the wheel and carry them forward, even when they are asleep, even when they don't realize it. College brought a different kind of memory, sacrifice. He got into a good school, better than I ever dreamed possible, but good schools come with big bills. I picked up overtime at the factory. Weekends blurred into weekdays. My hands cracked from the machines, my knees stiffened from the long hours on concrete floors. Sometimes I'd come home too tired to even eat, but the checks were mailed, the tuition paid. He called me once, freshman year, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Dad, you won't believe how amazing this place is. I feel like I belong here." And I smiled into the phone, hiding the exhaustion in my voice. "That's all I ever wanted for you, son, to feel like you belong." The echoes kept coming, one after another, each one carrying its own weight. The baseball game where he hit the winning run and turned to look for me in the bleachers. The night he couldn't sleep before his first debate and asked me to listen while he practiced. The time he broke his arm falling out of a tree and I carried him, sprinting all the way to the car. All those moments stacked together like bricks in a wall I built silently so he could climb higher. And yet, in that auditorium, when he spoke of gratitude, he didn't place a single brick of my name into his story. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he thought it went without saying. Maybe he believed that the audience wanted bigger names, professors, mentors, colleagues. But I couldn't stop thinking about the boy in the photograph on my mug, the boy who once drew me with a cape and called me Super Dad. At what point had I become invisible in his narrative? Memory is cruel sometimes. It doesn't just show you the past. It holds it up against the present like a mirror, daring you to compare. In the mirror, I saw a man who once mattered so much to a boy that even a scraped knee wasn't real until Dad kissed it. And in the reflection of that TED talk, I saw a man who no longer existed in the story his son told to the world. That week, I tried to shake it off. I kept myself busy. I fixed the gutter, mowed the lawn, painted the back steps, but no chore could silence the echoes. Every hammer strike, every brushstroke seemed to whisper, "You were there. You mattered. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." And yet, the auditorium silence haunted me more than the memories comforted me. Because sometimes the greatest ache doesn't come from being forgotten by the world. It comes from being forgotten by the one person whose memory you thought was safest. I don't know if you've ever felt that way. Maybe you've poured yourself into someone, your child, your spouse, a friend, only to realize one day that they've moved on without carrying your story with them. If you have, then you know this ache. It's not bitterness. It's not anger. It's simply emptiness. And emptiness has its own kind of echo. That night lying in bed, I whispered to myself, I was there. I was always there. But in the dark, even my own voice sounded unconvinced. The car ride after the talk was quiet at first, so quiet I could hear the turn signal clicking louder than usual, like a metronome marking time we'd never get back. My son sat in the back seat, scrolling through his phone, laughing now and then at messages that were probably pouring in from friends and colleagues. My wife sat in the passenger seat, turned halfway toward him, her voice full of warmth as she asked questions. "How did it feel up there?" she said. "Amazing," he replied. His voice carried the buzz of adrenaline, that post-performance high. The lights, the crowd, the energy, it was surreal. I can't believe I actually did it. I kept my eyes on the road. "People are already posting clips online," he added, his phone screen glowing against his face. "Look, there are hundreds of comments already." I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. His smile was wide, his eyes sparkling with the thrill of recognition. And all I could think was, does he even notice me here? The highway stretched ahead, endless ribbons of asphalt lit by the orange haze of streetlights. The radio was off. The hum of the tires filled the silence between their words. "Your delivery was so polished," my wife said. "You looked so confident up there." He laughed. "I was terrified at first. But then I remembered what Professor Lang always told me, nerves mean you care. And suddenly it felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." Professor Lang, another name, another mentor. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. My jaw ached from keeping it shut. At one point my wife turned toward me. "Wasn't he incredible?" she said. Her eyes shone with pride, as if asking me to echo her enthusiasm. I nodded. "He did great." That was all I managed. 2 words, because anything more might have cracked the dam inside me and I wasn't ready for the flood. In the rearview mirror, I caught my son's reflection. He didn't look up from his phone, didn't notice the heaviness in my voice. He was too busy riding the wave of applause that still carried him long after the curtain fell. I wanted to say something. Anything. I wanted to ask, "Did you realize you never said my name? Did you notice the silence where I should have been?" But the words caught in my throat, lodged like stones I couldn't swallow. Instead, I just drove. Memories surfaced again, uninvited. Driving him home from late-night rehearsals, driving him to tournaments, driving him to interviews. So many miles spent together in cars, the windows fogged with our laughter, our arguments, our quiet comforts. Now here we were together, yet miles apart even in the same vehicle. I thought of those nights when he'd fall asleep in the passenger seat, his head lolling against the window, trusting me to carry him home. That trust was invisible, unspoken. He never thanked me for it, but he didn't have to. A father doesn't need thanks for driving his son home. But this drive felt different. This time my silence wasn't an act of care. It was an act of defense. Halfway down the highway, my son leaned forward, excitement still bubbling. "You know what's crazy?" he said. "One of the organizers told me my talk might get picked up for the official TED channel. That could mean millions of views. Millions, can you imagine?" I forced a smile that I don't think he saw. "That's something." "Dad," he said, his eyes finally lifting from his phone to meet mine in the mirror. "Can you believe it, your son? Millions of people might hear my words." I held his gaze for a split second, then looked back at the road. "Yes," I said quietly, "I can believe it, because I had always believed in him, always, even when he forgot to believe in me." The rest of the drive blurred into headlights and shadows. My wife dozed off beside me, her head tilted against the window. My son hummed softly to himself in the back seat, still alive with the rhythm of applause and me. I drove in silence, each mile pressing the weight deeper into my chest. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically. My son hopped out first, stretching his arms wide. "Man, I'm starving," he said. "Do we have any leftovers?" "In the fridge," my wife mumbled, half asleep. He jogged up the steps, already pulling out his phone again. The front door slammed behind him, muffling the sound of his laughter as he dialed someone. My wife lingered by the car, yawning. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, though the lump in my throat said otherwise. She reached for my arm, squeezed it gently. "Don't hold it in too long," she whispered. Then she followed him inside. And I stayed in the driveway a while longer, the engine ticking as it cooled, the night air wrapping around me like a reminder. There's a certain kind of silence that only fathers know, the silence of wanting to say so much and choosing not to. The silence of swallowing your hurt so your child can enjoy their joy without guilt. That was the silence I carried that night. But silence doesn't heal. It only deepens the ache. As I sat there in the parked car, staring at the empty seat beside me, I whispered to the dark. I was there. I've always been there. But the night didn't answer back. The first letter began on the back of an old grocery receipt. I hadn't planned to write anything. I was just cleaning out my wallet, throwing away scraps, when I found a crumpled piece of paper. And something inside me, maybe the silence of that drive home, maybe the weight of the unspoken, pushed me to grab a pen. It started simply, "Dear son." Then I stared at the words for a long time, as though they belonged to a stranger. "Dear son." 2 words that should have felt natural, but suddenly felt like a foreign language. I hesitated, then kept writing. "You were incredible last night. I was so proud of you sitting there in the dark watching you shine, but I'll admit I was also hurt. You talked about gratitude, about the people who made you who you are, and you forgot me. I stopped there. My chest felt tight as if the pen had dug straight into my ribs. I folded the receipt and tucked it into my pocket. That night, lying awake in bed, I reached for it again. I unfolded the paper and read the words by the dim glow of the lamp. My wife stirred beside me. I quickly folded it back, slid it into the drawer. That was the beginning. The next day, I wrote another letter, this time on a piece of lined notebook paper from the stack we kept in the kitchen drawer. Dear son, do you remember when you were little and you made me a drawing of me in a cape? You called me Super Dad. I kept that drawing, you know. It's still in the garage. Some nights I take it out and I wonder if that boy would recognize the man I've become. Invisible, faded. I don't need a cape, but I guess I thought I'd always be somewhere in your story. I stopped again. My hands shook. I folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, but didn't seal it. I set it aside on the desk. I didn't send it. Soon, writing became a nightly ritual. I'd pour myself a cup of tea, sit at the kitchen table, and let the words spill. Some letters were short. I love you, that's all. Even when it hurts, I love you. Some were longer, pages filled with memories. Remember the night before your first debate? You were pacing the living room, practicing your speech, your voice cracking with nerves. You asked me to sit and listen. I did over and over until you finally believed you could stand on that stage. That night I believed harder than you did. Isn't that what fathers are for? Each time I finished, I folded the page, placed it into a growing stack in my desk drawer. Unsent. There's a strange comfort in writing letters no one will read. It's like shouting into a canyon and hearing your own voice echo back. You don't expect anyone to answer. You just need to hear yourself to prove you're still there. The letters became my echo, my way of reminding myself that I wasn't crazy, that my hurt was real, that my love was too. One night, I wrote something different. Dear son, maybe you didn't mention me because gratitude is easier when it's glamorous. Professors and mentors make for good stories on stage. Fathers are ordinary. We're background music, steady, forgettable. I suppose that's the job, to be the hum beneath the melody. Still, I wonder, would it have hurt to play a single note of me in your song? I sat there after writing it, staring at the words until the ink blurred. Then I folded it like the rest and placed it in the drawer. As the stack of letters grew, I started dating them. April 14th, April 21st, April 30th. I didn't want to lose track of the days, as if each letter was a bead on a rosary I could hold, counting my grief and my devotion at once. Some nights I thought about actually sending one. I'd pick up an envelope, run my finger along the flap, imagine it sliding into a mailbox. But then I'd picture his face, confused, maybe even annoyed. Dad, why didn't you just say this? Why did you write it down like some diary? So I never mailed them. I kept them hidden, locked away in the drawer like secrets only the paper could hold. Sometimes I imagined him finding them after I was gone, stumbling upon the stack, reading each page, realizing all the words I never said out loud. Would he cry? Would he regret? Would he finally see me then? I don't know. But the truth is, I wasn't writing them for him. I was writing them for me. One letter in particular still stays with me. Dear son, there's something you don't know. The night you were born, I held you in my arms and I made a promise. I whispered it into your tiny ear, though you couldn't understand me yet. I said, I will always be here. Even if the world forgets me, even if you forget me, I will be here. I've kept that promise. I always will. But I hope one day you'll remember too. When I finished, my hands were wet. I hadn't realized I'd been crying. By the end of that month, I had a drawer full of unsent letters. Some were stained with coffee rings. Some were crumpled, rewritten. Some had smudges where my hand brushed the ink before it dried. Each one carried a piece of me that I couldn't say out loud. And though I never sent them, I felt lighter after writing, because sometimes the act of speaking, even to paper, is enough to keep you alive. But a question lingered. If a father's gratitude, his pain, his love, lives only in unsent letters, does it exist at all? That question haunted me. And it was that haunting that led me, one restless night, to open my laptop and start typing instead of writing by hand. That was the night the blog was born. It happened on a night when sleep refused to come. I had written another letter, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer with the others. The drawer was nearly full now, brimming with unsent words, silent echoes. Yet when I turned off the light and lay down in bed, my chest felt heavier, not lighter. My wife was asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady. The house was quiet, but inside me the noise was deafening. The talk, the silence of my name, the drive home, all of it replayed in loops that refused to end. I got up, walked to the kitchen, made tea I didn't drink. Then, almost without thinking, I opened my laptop. I'm not much of a computer man. I check the news, maybe send an email now and then. But that night my fingers seemed to move on their own. I typed into the search bar, "how to start a blog for free." Hundreds of results popped up. I clicked one at random. Within minutes, I found myself staring at a blank white page on a screen, a cursor blinking like a heartbeat, daring me to begin. And I did. The first words I typed were not "Dear son." They were, "I am a father who feels invisible." I sat there, staring at that sentence. It looked both too small and too large all at once. Too small to hold the weight I felt inside. Too large to put out into the world, even under the mask of anonymity. But the cursor blinked, urging me on, so I kept going. I wrote about the talk, about sitting in the dark while my son shone in the spotlight, about waiting for my name and never hearing it. I wrote about the years that came before, the long shifts, the baseball games, the volcano project, the car rides, the sleepless nights. I wrote about love and sacrifice and how fathers don't need gratitude to survive, but maybe just a small acknowledgement to feel alive. And then I wrote the line that would later be quoted more than anything else. Gratitude is not a performance. It's not a speech or a standing ovation. Gratitude is the quiet noticing of the ones who carried you when no one was looking. When I finished, my hands hovered over the keyboard. Should I hit publish? I hesitated. My letters had always been private, a conversation with paper. This would be different. This would make my words public, even if no one knew it was me. Finally, I clicked publish. And just like that, my story slipped out into the world, nameless, faceless, free. I went to bed not expecting much. Honestly, I didn't expect anything at all. But when I checked the next morning, there were comments. Not many at first, just a handful. This spoke to me. I'm a mother and I feel invisible too. You're not alone. My daughter gave a wedding speech once, never mentioned me. I know this ache. Thank you for saying what so many of us feel but never say. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Strangers, complete strangers, were reading my words and they understood. For the first time since that night in the auditorium, I didn't feel completely alone. Over the next few days, the blog spread in ways I couldn't have imagined. Friends of friends shared it. Parenting forums reposted it. A local journalist even quoted a passage, calling it a raw, anonymous confession of fatherhood in the shadows. My inbox flooded with comments, stories from other parents, each one carrying its own invisible ache. A mother who had worked 3 jobs to put her daughter through law school, only to hear the daughter thank her mentors at graduation, but not her. A father who had sacrificed his own dreams so his son could play piano, only to watch the boy credit his natural talent in interviews. A grandmother who raised her grandkids while the parents were absent, only to be left out of the family photo album. Each story was different, but the ache was the same. Invisible love, forgotten sacrifices, gratitude that never made it into the spotlight. I never signed my name to the blog. I never gave away details that might reveal me. I was simply a father. But somehow, that anonymity made the words even louder. Because in being no one, I became everyone. One evening, I logged in to find that the post had been shared thousands of times. Tens of thousands. Headlines popped up. The anonymous father blog that's breaking the internet. Radio hosts read lines from it. People quoted it in sermons, in classrooms. I was stunned. My little midnight confession, typed on a whim, had traveled further than I ever dreamed. And for the first time, people weren't just listening to my son's words. They were listening to mine. But here's the strange part. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt conflicted. because while strangers were hearing me, my own son still wasn't. Late one night, scrolling through the flood of comments, I paused at one that cut deep. "I hope your son reads this someday, not for shame, but for understanding, because gratitude unspoken can wound more deeply than gratitude withheld." I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, those words echoing. I didn't write the blog to shame him. I didn't write it to expose him. I wrote it to remind myself that I was real, that I mattered. But now part of me wondered, would he stumble across it? Would he recognize me in the words? And if he did, what then? That night before bed, I wrote another letter I didn't send. "Dear son, the world is reading my story now, but I don't need the world to see me. I need you to. Because in all the noise of applause, in all the echoes of names you spoke, I only long to hear one thing, your voice remembering me." I folded the letter, added it to the drawer. Then I turned off the light, lay down, and listened to the silence. It was quieter than usual. Not because the ache had gone, but because for the first time in a long while I had spoken, and the world had answered back. I never expected words typed in the middle of the night to go anywhere. But sometimes words are like dandelion seeds. You blow them out into the air, and suddenly they're floating further than you can follow. That's what happened with my blog. One day it was just a hidden corner of the internet, an anonymous confession. The next, it was everywhere. The first sign was the email notification. "Your post has reached 10,000 views." I blinked at the number, convinced it was a glitch. 10,000 people, 10,000 strangers had read my story. By the end of that week, it was 100,000. By the next, 500,000. And still it grew. Journalists began quoting it. Parenting websites reposted whole paragraphs. Radio hosts debated on morning shows whether gratitude had become too performative in our culture. One line in particular traveled the farthest. "Gratitude is not a performance. It's the quiet noticing of the ones who carried you when no one was looking." Those words showed up everywhere, on Facebook posts, in Instagram captions, even printed on posters at schools. I watched in disbelief as my private ache became a public anthem. The comments poured in by the thousands. Some were simple. "Thank you, this is exactly how I feel." Some were raw confessions. "My son's wedding speech was about everyone except me. I cried in the bathroom. Reading this makes me feel less alone." Some were filled with regret. "My father passed away before I ever thanked him. Now I'd give anything for one more chance." And then there were messages from young people too. "I never realized my dad might feel this way. I'm going to call him right now." I read every single one. My tea went cold most nights as I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling, unable to look away. For the first time in years, strangers saw me, not as John or Mr. Miller or Dad, but as the invisible figure they themselves carried in their own lives. I was no longer just one father. I was every father who had ever sat in the dark, clapping, waiting for a name that never came. One morning, the local paper ran a front-page headline: "The Invisible Father, Anonymous Blog Strikes Chord Across America." I picked it up at the grocery store, my hands trembling as I read. There it was, my story in print for the whole town to see. Of course, no one knew it was mine. I stood in line behind a young mother who had the same paper in her cart. She glanced at the headline, sighed softly, and whispered to herself, "That's so true." I almost wanted to tell her that was me. Those were my words, but I didn't. I just smiled politely and bagged my groceries. Television followed soon after. Morning talk shows quoted my words. One anchor even called it a cultural wake-up call. I sat in my recliner, watching people on TV debate my pain like it was a philosophy lecture. One guest said parents shouldn't need public acknowledgement. Another argued that forgetting to thank the people who raised you was a symptom of our narcissistic times. I didn't agree fully with either side. My story wasn't meant to be an argument. It was just the truth of my heart. But truth, once loosed into the world, takes on a life of its own. At work, a coworker brought up the article. "Did you read that blog that's going viral, the Invisible Father one?" I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Yeah, I saw it. Powerful stuff," he said, shaking his head. Makes you think about how we treat our parents, huh? I wanted to laugh at the irony. If only you knew, I thought. Instead, I just muttered, yeah, makes you think. What surprised me most were the letters that started showing up in my P.O. box. I had created the box under the anonymous name when the blog asked for an optional contact. Envelope after envelope arrived, handwritten, stamped, carrying pieces of strangers' souls. One was from a grandmother in Ohio who raised 6 kids on her own. I've never told anyone how much it hurt when my son thanked his business partner but not me at his retirement party. Your words finally put into writing the ache I've carried for years. Another from a father in California. My daughter is a surgeon now. Everyone praises her talent. No one knows I cleaned offices for 20 years to keep her in school. Thank you for speaking what I couldn't. I sat at my desk, surrounded by letters, and realized the blog was no longer mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever loved quietly, invisibly. One evening, my wife found me reading those letters. She touched my shoulder gently. You know, she said, this is bigger than just you now. I nodded, I know. Do you feel lighter? She asked. I thought for a long moment. Not lighter, I said finally, but less alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son had given a talk to hundreds in that auditorium, hoping his words might ripple outward. And here I was, a nameless man with a laptop reaching millions. But my victory felt hollow, because the one person I longed to reach still hadn't heard me. Not yet. Then came the night everything shifted. I was at the kitchen table again, scrolling through the flood of comments when I saw a new one. I wonder if the son this father is writing about will ever read this. What would he say? My heart stuttered, because for the first time I realized he might. He might stumble across these words. He might recognize himself in the story. He might see me, not as the invisible father, but as his own father. The thought terrified me, but it also stirred something deeper. Because maybe, just maybe, that was the only way he'd finally hear me. It was a Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed. Not mine, his. I was sitting in my recliner watching the muted news on TV while he visited us for dinner. He doesn't come by often anymore, too busy with work, speaking engagements, conferences. But that night, maybe because his mother had cooked his favorite stew, he made the drive. The smell of onions and thyme still lingered in the kitchen when he looked up from his phone and said, "Have you guys heard about this blog? Everyone's sharing it, something about an invisible father." I froze. He turned the screen toward us. There it was, my words bold on his phone, framed by thousands of comments. Gratitude is not a performance. It's the quiet noticing of the ones who carried you when no one was looking. My wife shot me a glance, her eyes flickering with warning and worry. I kept my face still, my voice calm. "What's it about?" I asked, though I already knew. He scrolled, eyes narrowing in concentration. It's like this anonymous father talking about how his kid gave a speech and didn't mention him, and how he felt invisible. It's powerful. People are saying it's one of the most honest things about parenting they've read in years. He leaned back, shaking his head. It's gone viral. They're even quoting it in lectures. I saw a friend post about it on LinkedIn. I swallowed hard, the stew suddenly heavy in my stomach. He kept reading aloud, line after line. My lines. A father doesn't need applause, but sometimes he just needs to be seen. We build walls of sacrifice so our children can climb higher, even if they never notice the hands laying each brick. I watched his face shift as the words sank in. At first, curiosity, then quietness, then something heavier, guilt maybe, or recognition he didn't want to name. He set the phone down slowly. "It's strange. I feel like I know this man, like he's telling my story but from the other side." I forced a small laugh. "Maybe that's why it's resonating. It could be any father's story." "Yeah," he said, staring at the table, "but it feels close, too close." Later that night after he left, I found myself standing by the window, watching his car taillights disappear down the street. My wife joined me, her arms folded. "He's starting to suspect," she said quietly. I nodded, "but not yet. Do you want him to know?" I didn't answer right away. My throat felt tight. Finally, I whispered, "I don't know if I want him to know or if I just want him to listen." A week later, he called me unexpectedly. His voice was hesitant, different. "Dad," he said, "I can't stop thinking about that blog." I kept my tone steady. "Yeah, I've read it 3 times now. It really got to me. I keep asking myself if I've ever made you feel that way." My chest tightened. My instinct was to say, "Of course not, son. Don't worry," to protect him from the sting of truth. But instead, I let silence stretch between us, heavy and telling. He spoke again, softer this time. "Dad, have I ever made you feel invisible?" The question hung there, fragile as glass. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say everything the letters in my drawer carried. But I couldn't, not yet, so I said, "We'll talk when you come home." That weekend, he did. We sat in the living room, no TV, no phones, just the two of us. "I need to ask you something," he began, his voice unsteady. "That blog, it wasn't you, was it?" I looked at him, at the boy who once wore a crooked baseball cap, at the man now sitting with worry etched into his forehead, and I stayed quiet, because sometimes silence says more than words. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "God, Dad, it is you, isn't it?" My eyes didn't leave his. He sank back into the couch, his face pale. I don't know what to say. I leaned forward, my voice gentle. "Then don't say anything, just listen." For the first time I told him, not everything, not yet, but enough. About sitting in the audience that night waiting for my name. About the hollow ache of being forgotten. About the years of quiet sacrifice that weren't meant for applause but still longed for acknowledgement. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He just listened, his eyes glistening. When I finished, the room was heavy with silence again. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry." The word cracked something in me. Not anger, not triumph, just release. Because sometimes that's all a father needs to hear. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because while he now knew the truth, I still didn't know what he would do with it. Would he bury it, forget it, pretend it never happened? Or would he finally learn what gratitude truly means? Not on a stage, not in front of strangers, but here in the quiet space between father and son. I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew the echoes of my words had finally reached him. And that was a beginning. It was a Saturday afternoon when he came over. Not planned, not expected, just a knock at the door that felt heavier than usual. I opened it to find him standing there, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, eyes restless. My wife greeted him with a warm hug, but I noticed the stiffness in his shoulders. "Dad," he said, voice low, "can we talk?" I nodded, stepping aside. "Of course." We ended up in the living room, just the two of us. No TV this time, no noise to cover the silences. He sat on the edge of the couch, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. I sat across from him in my old recliner, the same one I'd occupied during countless bedtime stories, lectures about homework, late-night check-ins. Only now the space between us felt like a canyon. He broke the silence first. "I need to know the truth. That blog, it was you, wasn't it?" His eyes searched mine, desperate for an answer he already knew. I didn't move. I didn't nod. I just let the weight of his question hang in the room. After a long pause, I said quietly, "What if it was?" He exhaled sharply, running both hands through his hair. "Then I don't know how to feel, guilty, embarrassed, angry at myself. God, Dad, I didn't know I'd hurt you like that." I studied him, this man who was once my boy, the boy who used to run toward me across playgrounds. Now he looked like a child again, not in size but in shame. "Do you remember that night?" I asked. "Of course," he said quickly. "It was one of the biggest nights of my life." "And for me too," I said softly. I sat there, waiting, listening. Every name you mentioned was a reminder of someone who mattered to you. But the silence where my name should have been, I trailed off, my throat tightening. That silence was louder than anything else. He lowered his head, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to erase you." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked. The hum of the refrigerator filled the house. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. Finally, he said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me right away? Why write it online to strangers instead of to me?" The question cut deep. "Because I didn't know how," I admitted. "I've spent my life showing love by doing, working, providing, driving, fixing. Talking about the hurt I carry, that's not something I was ever good at." I leaned back, exhaling. "The blog wasn't about shaming you. It wasn't even about you, not entirely. It was about me, about fathers like me, about the ache of being unseen. I never thought you'd read it. He lifted his head, tears bright in his eyes. But I did. Yes, I whispered, you did. He stood suddenly, pacing the room, his hands gesturing in frustration, not at me, I realized, but at himself. I talked about gratitude, he said, voice rising. I built an entire speech around it. And the one person I owed the most thanks to, the one person who sacrificed the most, I didn't mention. How could I be so blind? I watched him, my heart aching not with anger but with tenderness. Because gratitude isn't always obvious, I said. It's easy to thank the mentors, the professors, the friends who say the right words at the right time. But the people who carry you day after day, who do the ordinary, invisible things, sometimes they are the easiest to forget. He stopped pacing, turned to me. But you're not ordinary, Dad. You're not invisible. His voice cracked and he sank back onto the couch. You're the reason I even stood on that stage. The tears he had been holding back finally fell. And for the first time in years, I saw my son cry the way he used to when he was small, unguarded, unashamed, raw. I crossed the room and sat beside him. I didn't say anything at first. I just put a hand on his shoulder, steady, the same way I had when he fell off his bike all those years ago. Dad, he choked out, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I squeezed his shoulder gently. I know, son. No, he insisted, turning to face me. You don't understand. I've been so caught up in proving myself to the world and chasing applause that I forgot who was clapping the loudest in the dark. You, always you. I felt my own tears then, burning hot down my cheeks. I never needed applause, I said quietly. I just needed to know I was seen. For a long time we just sat there side by side, father and son. No TED stage, no viral blog, no strangers' comments, just us stripped down to the raw truth. He leaned into me the way he hadn't since he was a boy. I wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. In that embrace, the canyon between us narrowed. When the silence finally broke, it was him who spoke. I want to make this right, he said. Not just for you, but for every father like you. I need people to know the truth about gratitude, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that builds lives quietly, brick by brick. I looked at him, at the determination shining through his tears. And how will you do that? He smiled faintly through the wetness on his cheeks. You'll see. That night, after he left, I sat in my recliner and let the tears come again. But this time they weren't just from pain. They were from something else. Relief, hope, maybe even healing. The confrontation had been hard, painful, necessary, because sometimes hearts have to break open before they can truly meet. And in that breaking, I felt something shift between us. For the first time since that night in the auditorium, I no longer felt invisible. I felt seen. The next morning, the house felt different, lighter somehow. Maybe it was just me. Maybe carrying truth, finally speaking it aloud, had lifted something I didn't realize I'd been dragging behind me all these years. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I'd written so many unsent letters, sipping coffee from the faded mug with his little league photo. The steam curled into the air like a quiet benediction. That's when the door opened and there he was again. "Morning, Dad," he said. His voice was softer than usual, like he was afraid of startling me. "Morning," I answered. He sat down across from me, folding his hands. For a moment he didn't say anything. Neither did I. Silence had been our prison for weeks, but now, strangely, it felt like an open field, room to breathe, to wait, to let words arrive when they were ready. Finally, he spoke. "I couldn't sleep last night. I kept hearing your voice, the way you said you just wanted to be seen." I set my mug down. His eyes were red, his hair a mess from tossing and turning. "I realized something," he continued. "I've spent so much of my life chasing recognition, applause, views, praise, that I didn't notice the one person who deserved it most was sitting right here. You never asked for a stage, you just asked for me." His voice cracked on that last word, me. I leaned forward, hands clasped. "I never wanted to take anything from you, son. Not your moment, not your spotlight. I just wanted to know I hadn't disappeared from your story." "You haven't," he said quickly. Then softer, "At least, not in my heart. But maybe I didn't show it. Maybe I forgot that gratitude isn't real unless you live it. For a while, we sat there in the soft light of morning, two men tangled in both guilt and love. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I tried to write a speech last night," he said, "but it didn't feel right. It felt forced, so I just wrote this instead." He slid the paper across the table. I opened it carefully. The words were shaky, uneven, as though he had written them in the dark. "Dad, thank you. For the rides, the late nights, the sacrifices I never noticed. For being the steady presence when I was too young to understand what that meant. For carrying me quietly, invisibly, all these years. I see you now. I always should have. I always will." My hands trembled as I held the letter. For so long I had been the one writing letters unsent. Now for the first time I was the one receiving one. I looked up, tears stinging my eyes. "This means more than you know. I hope it's not too late," he whispered. "It's never too late to say thank you," I said. We went for a walk that afternoon. Just the two of us, no audience, no microphones. The sun was out, the air crisp, the trees along the street whispering in the breeze. As we walked, he talked, not about work, not about projects or events, but about memories. "Do you remember the volcano project?" he asked suddenly. I laughed. "How could I forget? I'm pretty sure I still have flour paste under my fingernails." He smiled. "I never told you, but that night you taught me more than science. You taught me persistence. I think about that every time I face something that feels impossible." We kept walking, memory after memory surfacing like stepping stones across a river. Each one a reminder that our story was built not on stages or applause, but on the quiet, unglamorous moments that held us together. At one point, we stopped by the park where I used to take him as a boy. The swings were still there, though rusted now. He sat down on one, pushing himself gently with his feet, staring at the sky. "I think I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if I gave credit to you, people would think I hadn't earned my success. That they'd say I was just the product of my father's sacrifices, not my own hard work." I let out a long breath. "Son, every child is the product of someone else's sacrifices. That doesn't erase what you've achieved, it gives it roots." He nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. That evening, back at the house, we cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, but it felt holy in its own way. He chopped onions while I stirred the sauce. We bumped shoulders, laughed at little mistakes, worked in a rhythm that felt like music. When we sat down to eat, my wife joined us, her eyes bright with quiet relief. She didn't say much, but I saw it in her smile. The canyon between us had begun to close. After dinner, as he was getting ready to leave, he paused at the door. "Dad," he said, turning back to me, "I can't undo the past, but I can live differently moving forward. I don't just want to thank you privately. I want the world to know, too, not because you need it, but because I owe it to the truth." I studied him for a moment, the determination in his face. "Gratitude doesn't have to be public to be real," I said gently, "but if your heart tells you to share it, then follow it." He nodded. "I will." That night, after he drove away, I opened the drawer where all my unsent letters lay. Dozens of pages, folded and hidden. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to write another one. Instead, I took them out, stacked them neatly, and tied them with a piece of string. They were no longer unsent confessions. They were reminders of a journey, of silence, of ache, of love that endured even when unacknowledged. I placed the bundle back in the drawer, but this time it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like closure. Reconciliation doesn't erase pain. It doesn't rewrite the past, but it does soften the sharp edges. It turns silence into conversation, distance into closeness, invisibility into presence. As I lay in bed that night, I whispered the same words I had whispered when he was a newborn in my arms. "I will always be here." But now, for the first time in a long while, I believed he saw me. And that made all the difference. The invitation came a few weeks later. It wasn't another TED event or some glittering national conference. It was a small gathering at the local community center, an auditorium no bigger than a high school gym, the kind of place where folding chairs squeak and the microphone hums before it finds its voice. "They asked me to speak," my son said over dinner one evening. Not about success, not about big ideas, just about gratitude. And I want you to be there. I nodded slowly, of course. But inside I wondered, what will he say this time? The night of the talk, the air smelled of coffee brewing in styrofoam cups. People greeted each other in the aisles, neighbors and students, families with young kids. This wasn't an audience hungry for headlines. This was community, ordinary people who lived the same rhythms of work and family I'd lived all my life. We found our seats near the back. My wife squeezed my hand gently, her eyes shining. When my son walked onto that stage, it wasn't with the polish of a practiced performer. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his tie a little loose, his smile nervous but genuine. "Good evening," he began. The microphone cracked and a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. He laughed too, shoulders relaxing. "I want to tell you a story tonight," he said. "Not about professors or mentors or colleagues, not about grand ideas, just about a man who sat in the back row of my life, quietly carrying me forward." My heart thudded in my chest. He spoke of childhood, of bike rides down steep streets, of late-night science projects, of car rides where he slept while someone else stayed awake to drive. He spoke of sacrifice, long hours at a factory, double shifts, weekends traded for tuition bills. And then he said it. My father was my invisible hero. I didn't always see him. I didn't always thank him. In fact, the most important night of my life, I forgot to mention his name. But tonight I want to say it plainly, without microphones or spotlights. "Dad, thank you." His voice cracked. The audience turned, some even craning their necks until their eyes found me in the back row. I felt heat rush to my face, embarrassment mixing with pride. I nodded once, too choked to speak. The applause came, but it was different this time. Not thunderous, not performative, just warm, steady, human. My son smiled through tears. Gratitude isn't about grand gestures. It's about noticing the people who carried you when no one else saw. My father carried me, and I see him now. Something inside me unclenched then. The knot I'd carried since that first talk loosened, unraveling into something softer. Afterward, people came up to shake his hand, pat his back. Some even came to me. "You must be proud," one woman said. I smiled, eyes wet. "More than you know." On the drive home, the silence was different, not heavy, not aching, just peaceful. My wife leaned her head against the window, humming softly. My son sat beside me this time, not in the back. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't know if I can ever repay everything you've done." I kept my eyes on the road, but I smiled. "You just did." That night, back at home, I went to the drawer with the bundle of unsent letters. For the first time, I opened it not out of ache, but out of reverence. I untied the string and read one at random. My handwriting, months old, stared back at me. "I just want to be seen." I closed the letter, folded it back, because now I was. Reconciliation is one thing, public acknowledgement is another. But what mattered most wasn't the applause or the crowd or even the second stage. What mattered was the look in my son's eyes when he said the words. He saw me. And in that moment, I realized I had never needed the world to know. I had only ever needed him. Life didn't change overnight after that second stage. The world didn't suddenly paint my name in headlines, and I didn't expect it to. But something in me shifted. For months, I had carried the weight of invisibility, the ache of being forgotten in the very moment I longed to be remembered. I had written letters I never sent, built a blog that escaped into the world, watched strangers carry my pain as though it were their own. And finally, my son carried it too. That was enough. In the weeks after his small-town speech, he called more often, sometimes just for a minute between meetings or while walking to his car. "Hey, Dad, just wanted to check in." Other times he asked about memories I hadn't thought of in years. "Do you remember the time you drove me to that debate tournament in the snow? I was so nervous I thought I'd be sick. But you just kept talking to me, calm as anything. I think that's why I could stand up and do it." I'd smile, the memory warming me. "Yeah, I remember." It was as if he was stitching back together the quilt of our story, patch by patch, making sure none of the pieces got lost again. One Sunday afternoon, he came by with a folder in his hand. "I've been working on something," he said, laying it on the table. Inside were notes for a new talk, not for a stage, but for a workshop he wanted to hold with students at a local school. He pointed to a page near the middle. This section's about family. I want them to understand that success isn't just individual, it's collective. It's about the people who invest in you even when you don't see it. He looked up, his eyes steady on mine. I want them to know what you taught me. I swallowed hard, my throat thick. I think they'll hear it, son. I still kept the drawer of letters. I never threw them away. Sometimes I'd open it, run my fingers across the folded papers, not with bitterness but with tenderness. Those letters had carried me through the silence. They had given me a voice when I couldn't speak, but I didn't add to them anymore, because now, when something pressed heavy on my heart, I picked up the phone. "Hey, son," I'd say, "just wanted to tell you something." And he listened. That was more than enough. Gratitude, I learned, doesn't always arrive on stage with a spotlight. Sometimes it arrives in small ways: an unexpected phone call, a smile across the dinner table, a sentence written shakily on lined paper. Sometimes gratitude is loud, but often it's quiet, and maybe that's the truest kind. One evening, I found myself back at the community center where he'd given that second speech. The chairs were stacked, the stage empty. I sat in the back row, the same place I had before. I closed my eyes and let the silence wrap around me. For the first time in a long while, that silence didn't feel like erasure. It felt like peace, because I finally understood I had never been invisible. My love, my presence, my sacrifices, they had been there all along, woven into the man my son had become. He saw me now, and maybe in some quiet way he always had. As I sit here tonight writing these words, I realize something else. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to every parent who has clapped from the shadows, every unseen figure who has carried someone else's dreams. If you are one of them, let me say this: you matter. Even if your name isn't spoken on stages, even if the world never knows, you matter. Your love is not invisible. And to you, the listener, who has walked with me through these 12 chapters, I thank you. Thank you for lending me your time, your heart, your ears. Thank you for letting my story echo in your own. Perhaps you've known this ache too. Perhaps you've been the invisible one, or perhaps you've realized there is someone in your life who has carried you without recognition. If so, I hope you'll reach out to them. Whisper the words they've longed to hear. It's never too late to say thank you. So I leave you with this: gratitude isn't about applause. It's not about perfect speeches or viral moments. Gratitude is quiet. It's human. It's the hand on your shoulder, the phone call at dusk, the whisper in the dark: "I see you, thank you."